Hello everybody, welcome to Psychology 303, Analysis of Everyday Behavior. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about extinction. So previously we've talked about reinforcement that kind of helps people increase the frequency of performing a certain behavior. But what if we want to decrease a behavior, decrease frequency, intensity, etc.? Well, instead of reinforcing it, we should stop reinforcing it. If something isn't reinforced, then people are not going to continue to behave in that way. And that is basically what we're talking about when we introduce extinction. So what are some examples? So we see extinction appear in everyday situations all the time. So if you use a vending machine or a coffee machine every morning to get a soft drink or a coffee, you press a button, you enter in money, and you get a coffee. So the behavior of pressing the button is reinforced by you actually getting coffee. But what if coffee doesn't come out? What if you press the button and coffee doesn't appear? The machine doesn't work. Well, if that continues to happen, if you keep pressing the button, maybe the next day you try it again, coffee still doesn't come out, the machine appears to be not working, then you're not going to press the button anymore. You're not going to use that coffee machine anymore. That behavior then becomes extinguished. What if I use a shortcut to get into my apartment building, for example, an emergency exit that the alarm doesn't go off and is unlocked? Well, what if all of a sudden it is locked? What if all of a sudden that alarm does go off? Well, my behavior of using that shortcut, of using that door, is no longer reinforced. I'm no longer getting to my apartment any quicker. So that behavior becomes extinguished. It is no longer reinforced, and that behavior basically decreases the frequency of occurring. So we're going to be talking about punishment next week, but one of the primary ways of eliminating a behavior or reducing the frequency of a behavior is through extinction. And basically what we do is we stop reinforcing a behavior. If your little sister is pestering you, poking you, they'll continue to do so if you continue to get annoyed by it or reinforce it. But if you just stop reacting to it altogether, then that behavior is going to go away. It's going to be extinguished. So those are some examples. So there's been a lot of research examining extinction, especially in conjunction with reinforcement. We see animals are influenced by extinction. If that specific behavior is no longer reinforced, that behavior goes away. We can see this applied to humans as well, especially with children. Children throwing tantrums, if you don't give them attention, then they stop throwing tantrums to a certain extent. If a child is hitting themselves over and over again, trying to decrease that behavior, again, not giving them attention if they're doing this, trying to find ways of not reinforcing that behavior. One little quirk of extinction is known as extinction burst. And that's where, say a person has a specific behavior. Let's stick with children. Say a child is throwing a tantrum, and instead of the parent actually giving them attention when they start yelling, the parent ignores them. So they're not reinforcing that behavior by giving the child attention. Well, the child starts to get annoyed by this and all of a sudden starts to kick it up a notch. They really start to go crazy, throwing their arms, screaming louder than you've heard them scream before. This is an example of what's called extinction burst. That's where the behavior, the strength of the behavior increases to an extent to which it had before, right before the behavior becomes extinguished. So we've all been in a situation probably where we try and turn on the television by pressing the on button on the remote and it doesn't work. So what do? We keep pressing it. If it doesn't work, we try and press it harder or press it faster, thinking that that would work. So again, that behavior is intensified in some way, pressing the button harder to try and hopefully get that reinforcer that we're hoping for the TV to turn on. So that's one of the quirks of extinction, is you end up with extinction burst. And sometimes it can be difficult. You have to kind of mentally prepare for it, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So we can increase the strength of the behavior. We can also have novel behaviors appear as a part of the extinction burst. So maybe a vending machine's not working when you press the button. Well, you start to shake the vending machine to get the little thing out instead. If the chips are hanging off at the end of the little squiggly do. You know what I'm talking about. What if a door doesn't work? Well, maybe we start to ram our shoulder into the door to get it open, or we shake the handle in ways that we typically wouldn't. Sometimes we can have these novel behaviors appear. And again, if you are initiating the extinction on someone else, especially a child, it's good to be mentally prepared for these kind of things to possibly happen. And also, extinction bursts can happen without intentionality. So people just behave in this way without realizing that they are increasing the strength and intensity of the behavior. And oftentimes, because they're trying to do things differently, and it's still not working, the person can often feel frustrated as a result. And that frustration oftentimes helps people to end up not performing the behavior at all as a result. So we have extinction bursts that can lead to the extinction of the behavior, but we can also have something called spontaneous recovery. That's when if the person performs the behavior one time and it is reinforced. So again, we're trying to eliminate the reinforcement of the behavior through extinction. But maybe at one point during that process, it is reinforced one time. The child yells and we happen to look over and give them attention. Then we see in this instance, the child kind of reemerge and kind of jump back up to where they were before in terms of how frequently they perform the target behavior. So oftentimes this can occur, again, when a person is reinforced for behaving in that way, or it can occur if people end up going into a situation similar to when they would perform the behavior previously. So we could think about an alcoholic who's trying to stop drinking. Well, if they go into a bar, then that's a similar situation to when they perform that behavior that they're trying to get rid of, drinking alcohol, and that could lead to them performing that behavior more often as a result. So we talked a little bit about the different types of reinforcement and how they have an impact on the effectiveness of reinforcement. It also applies to extinction. So the type of reinforcement that you use, whether it be positive or negative, has an impact on what type of extinction you need to use. So if a behavior is positively reinforced, you want to withhold that reinforcer. You want to not give the child attention. But alternatively, if a behavior is negatively reinforced, you want to, again, if you think about negative reinforcement, that's when a person has some kind of adverse stimulus removed from the environment whenever they perform the behavior. Well, in terms of extinction, you want to keep that adverse stimulus in the environment. If the stimulus is still in the environment, then a person's realizing that their behavior is not eliminating that adverse stimulus, and so performing the behavior doesn't actually do anything. So if a child is acting up in class, typically they might think that if they act up, then they can get out of being in class. Well, if you keep them in class, then maybe they will be less likely to actually act up. Also, the difference between continuous and intermittent reinforcement is an important consideration. We talked about how continuous reinforcement will lead to the quickest increase in behavior, increase in frequency of behavior. Well, continuous extinction will also lead to the quickest decrease. And we tend to find that if we use extinction on behaviors that are continuously reinforced, they tend to decrease much faster than if we use extinction on behaviors that are intermittently reinforced. There seems to be this kind of resistance to extinction with intermittent reinforcement because, again, if you think about it, not every instance of behavior is reinforced. So it's sometimes difficult to understand when a behavior is ideal or not ideal if it's being intermittently reinforced and subsequently extinguished. One important thing I want to mention is that extinction is not simply ignoring a behavior. That is the case if attention is the reinforcer. So we talked about in terms of a lot of behaviors of children, they do things to get attention from parents. Ignoring the behavior would be extinction. But that's not always the case where attention is the reinforcer. A child might be behaving in a specific way to get out of eating their vegetables, for example. So it's important to understand exactly what is the reinforcer for that behavior that you're trying to get rid of before you start the extinction process. So speaking of using extinction as a treatment, extinction is probably one of the most fundamental intervention strategies to use to eliminate behaviors, just as reinforcement is to increase or start up behaviors. As we've talked about previously in earlier weeks, using a functional assessment is key to figure out, all right, what is reinforcing this behavior in the first place. And then after you do that, there are some other considerations you need to make to figure out whether or not you can actually use extinction, I don't want to say legally, but ethically, if it's okay for you to even use extinction in certain situations with certain behaviors. So for example, you can't use extinction if a reinforcer can't be actually removed. So a great example of this is bullies perform this undesirable behavior of bullying other children to get attention from other students. Well, it's very difficult to, as a teacher, remove the attention of other students from bullies. So you might need to use a different strategy in that situation. You can't use extinction if it's unsafe to remove the reinforcer. So say a child runs out into the street in traffic to get attention. Well, you can't just simply remove attention in that situation, because then the child would just be running out into the street and possibly get hit by a car. So again, you would need to use a different strategy there. And lastly, you need to be prepared for extinction bursts to occur, and extinction burst needs to be somewhat safe. So we talked a little bit about a child who hits themselves. Imagine an extinction burst in that situation. A child could do some serious damage to themselves. So you either need to prepare for that or use a different strategy altogether. And especially in terms of maybe children who are having a hard time calming down, who are yelling, throwing tantrums a lot, that extinction burst can be very difficult for mommy and daddy to deal with. So again, mentally preparing for the fact that the child's going to go through this extinction burst, but then afterwards they are going to calm down and that behavior is going to be extinguished. Keeping that in mind is extremely important. Lastly, some other key considerations to think about when using extinction as treatment is the schedule of reinforcement. Again, we made a distinction between continuous and intermittent reinforcement, and how continuous reinforcement is easier to extinguish. So to a certain extent, if you have a behavior that's intermittently reinforced, you might actually want to transition into being continuously reinforced. And then from there, you can use extinction to extinguish the behavior a lot more faster and effectively. We'll talk a little bit about this when we talk about differential reinforcement, but yes, we want to extinguish negative behaviors, but ideally we want to replace that behavior with something a little bit more functional. We want to reinforce alternative behaviors at the same time we are reducing negative behaviors or undesirable behaviors. And then lastly, again, we'll talk a little bit about this in the coming weeks, but when we extinguish our behavior, we want to promote generalization and we want to promote maintenance. So what does that mean? Well, if we extinguish our behavior in one situation, we also want that behavior to disappear in other appropriate situations. And we also want that extinguished behavior to continue. We don't want it to just occur in this one instance of time. We want that behavior to not appear at any other point in the future. So that's all I had today for extinction. Thank you for your time and attention. I will see you all in the next video. Thanks.